All right, let's take a look at those Jacksonville Jaguars and see what did they do for the 2018 offseason. What did they do during free agency, and what did they do in the draft? First, let's look at their cap situation. How much money did they have to work with to begin with? Well, at the beginning of free agency, the beginning of the offseason, they had $23 million in cap space. Now, in August, they have about $11.2 million. So they definitely spent some of that money that they had available. How did they spend it? Well, let's take a look in a minute. But before we do, let's look at some guys that I thought at the beginning of the offseason might get cut to create some additional room. And let's see what actually happened. First, Chris Ivory was a name that obviously was at risk of getting cut. As you can see in 2015, huge season, 1,000 yards rushing, 7 touchdowns, plus he was a receiving threat, 4.3 yards a carry. By 2016, his numbers were down to 439 yards. His yards per carry dropped to 3.8, only had 3 touchdowns. And then last year in 14 games, 382 yards, 1 touchdown, 3.4 yards per carry. You know, he was turning 30 during this offseason. It was obviously time to cut him loose. And they were able to save more than $3 million doing so. You know, the Jacksonville Jaguars already have Fournette. That's their main guy. They still have T.J. Yeldon. They got Corey Grant. It just didn't make any sense at all to keep Chris Ivory around at $3 million a year. Allen Hurns was another guy that I thought was at risk of getting cut because you can look at his numbers here. In 2015, he had 1,000 yards receiving and 10 touchdowns. In 2014, he had 677 yards and 6 touchdowns. But then these last 2 years, his numbers haven't been as good, and he's missed, several games. So in 2016, he had 477 yards. Last year, he had 484 yards, only played in 10 games. So the fact that they were able to save $6.9 million and even more in the future seasons, that made it kind of a no-brainer. So between Chris Ivory and Allen Hurns, they were able to save about $10 million. So pretty good savings from getting rid of those 2 guys. Hurns was able to find another home in Dallas, and he got a comparable contract. He was able to get a deal worth $6 million. So not a huge loss in income for Allen Hurns. And Texas has no state income tax. So it ended up working out okay for him. And the Jaguars have a few other decent young wide receivers. Who were the offensive unrestricted free agents? Who were the guys that were at risk of signing with other teams? Allen Robinson, that's the big name. Allen Robinson. He is a guy who is coming off of an ACL. He tore his ACL last year in the first game of the season. Early in the first game, I think it was like the first play of the year. But before that, the guy was a star. You can see in 2015, he had 1,400 yards receiving plus 14 touchdowns. That's huge numbers from Allen Robinson. The next year, he followed it up with 883 yards and 6 touchdowns. So, if he can bounce back from his injury, from that ACL injury, he's going to be a good pickup for Chicago. a second round pick. Chicago paid him 3 years and $42 million. $14 million a year for a guy coming off an ACL. Chicago was desperate. I don't blame the Jags for letting him walk. I really don't. That's a really big contract for a guy who's coming on. I mean, they wanted to keep... I thought they were going to franchise him. I really, really did. A lot of people thought they were going to franchise him. But they decided to let him walk instead. So, it'll be interesting to see, how it works out with their wide receivers. Marquise Lee was their other second-round pick. Okay. Allen Hurns was picked 61st. Marquise Lee was actually picked earlier at 39th. He's never had a season as good as Robinson did. He never had 1,000-yard, 1,400 yards, 14 touchdowns. No. But, he did have 851 yards in 2016. He did have 700 yards last season. So he is a decent kind of number 2 option, and they were able to sign him for 4 years and $38 million, a little under $10 million a year. It's a pretty big size contract for a guy. We'll see. We'll see how he performs. It's a pretty big contract if he's not a number 1 wide receiver. It's a cheap contract if he's a number 1 wide receiver. It's a pretty expensive contract for a number 2 wide receiver. He really needs to get 800-900 yards a season to justify that kind of contract. So we'll see what happens. Good, but not as good as Robinson. But once again, the Jags have Keelan Cole and D.D. Westbrook. So we'll see how the wide receiver core looks next season. Patrick Omameh was a guard, the starting guard there in Jacksonville. He was good, but he wasn't great. He was playing on a 1-year, $875,000 deal. And he was able to get a 3-year, $15 million deal with the Giants. The Giants signed Nate Solder at left tackle. They signed Omameh to play guard. They drafted Will Hernandez. I mean, this isn't a podcast or video on the Giants, but, I'm just saying the Giants really worked to improve their offensive line, and they were able to poach Omameh from the Jags. But we'll talk about it in just a couple of minutes. The Jags went to replace somebody with Omameh, and he's pretty good too. So they let Omameh walk rather than pay him 3 years and $15 million. Who were the defensive players who were unrestricted free agents? A big name, Paul Posluszny. All right, you can see those numbers over his career. Ridiculous numbers. Averaged well over 100 tackles per season. Had 162 tackles in 2013, 133 tackles with 11 tackles for a loss in 2015, another 130 tackles in 2016 with 9 tackles for a loss, but last year had 61 tackles, a big drop-off. He's going to be 34 years old. He would have been 34 years old, this season if he played. He'll be 34 years old regardless, but he would have been an old linebacker. He's the all-time leading tackler in Jags history, but he's just no longer an every down linebacker. He's, first, second down linebacker, but not a guy who's going to be able to play in coverage on third down if need be. He finished a 3-year deal that averaged $5 million a year. I think certainly the first 2 years of that deal, super value, great value. Last year, maybe he was a bit overpaid. He decided to retire. Very emotional news conference. Very, very emotional news conference. Telvin Smith cried. This guy is a really great leader, and I think his teammates really were going to miss him. Are going to miss him. There was a lot of respect for the guy in the locker room after all he did for the Jags. He was a warrior. He went out there and fought even when he was injured. Great player, great person, Paul Posluszny, but he won't be back. Looking at cornerback, Aaron Colvin, he was the team's nickel corner. And he got a big deal with Houston. 4 years, $34 million. And that was expected because he performed great. The Jags really had an incredible secondary last year. Maybe the best secondary in the NFL. Either they or the Vikings. Really, really good secondary. And Aaron Colvin was probably one of the best nickel corners in the league. So that's why Houston decided to give him, an $8 million plus per year contract, so that give him a chance to play maybe on the outside. So Aaron Colvin earned a big raise, and that's a big loss for the Jags. Lorente McCray is a backup linebacker for the Jags. He played on a 1-year, $2 million deal. And the Jags decided to bring him back and gave him 2 years and $4.75 million to return. So not a big raise, about $2.34 million per year. But he got a little baby raise, and they decided to bring back Lorente McCray. Peyton Thompson was a backup safety. He played on a 1-year, $690,000 deal, but the Jags so far have elected not to bring him back. Let's take a look and summarize the changes on the Jags roster. What are all the major differences from last season? Well, first at quarterback, you have Chad Maheny. So he is out. He was the backup quarterback to Bortles, but he won't be back, and in comes Cody Kessler. So he'll be the player backing up Blake Bortles. They also drafted Tanner Lee in the 6th round. So overall, I'd say not a huge change, but I don't know if Cody Kessler is a step up from Chad Henne. At running back, Chris Ivory is out. We talked about that, but they have a few really good running backs, so not a major loss there. At wide receiver, Allen Robinson, that's a big loss. I mean, last year, what did he provide? Well, he provided nothing because he had a torn ACL. But before that, this was a big-time part of the offense. Number 1 wide receiver, and he won't be back because he signed with the Bears. Allen Hurns will be gone. He was cut and signed with Dallas. Aurelius Ben will be gone because he won't be brought back. So now you got to see, who are they going to replace these guys with? Well, you got Dante Moncrief. He was a number 2 wide receiver last year. DJ Clark, 2nd round pick. And Tavon Smith, who has been a practice squad player for most of his career. Overall, I don't think this is an upgrade over, here's the thing. It's an upgrade over what they had last year, in the sense that if you look at Allen Hurns' numbers, okay, there's Allen Hurns' number. He only had 484 yards. But Dante Moncrief had only 391 yards, but his best season was 733 yards. Remember, last season, Andrew Luck wasn't there. He also missed several games. He's had some injuries the last couple of seasons. But if he plays healthy and to his full potential, I think Dante Moncrief is potentially an upgrade over Allen Hurns. So if you look at Allen Hurns' best season, he had 1,000 yards receiving and 10 touchdowns. So I say Dante Moncrief is about an average replacement for Allen Hurns. He's in the same ballpark. Allen Robinson that's just a huge loss, period. But last year he didn't play, and the Jags still came really close, to beating the Patriots. So, I don't know. I'd say they downgraded at wide receiver, but they did bring in DJ Chark in the second round as well. So, they have some players there that will be able to compete. It'll be interesting to look at the offense and see how they end up. At tight end, Mercedes Lewis, their number one tight end with the Jags, 300 yards last season. He'll be 34 years old. He's out. Who's in? Austin Seferian-Jenkins is in. He was the number one tight end for the Jets last year. Had 357 yards in 13 games. Was the best season of his career. He'll be 26 this coming season. He's a player trending upwards. He struggled with some alcohol abuse early in his career. Seems to have his life together. He could have a big season. Maybe. I definitely think he's an upgrade over Mercedes Lewis. Niles Paul, they also brought in Niles Paul. He had one good season in 2014, but last year only had 94 yards receiving in 14 games. But overall, I'd say tight end looks better. What about on the offensive line? The Jags drafted Will Richardson in the 4th round. He'll provide some depth. At guard, earlier I talked about it, Patrick Omameh is out. But Andrew Norwell is in. They gave Norwell a 5-year, $65 million deal, one of the highest paid offensive linemen in the league. But he is a very strong player at guard. Definitely an upgrade. I mean, Patrick Omameh was not bad, but he's no Andrew Norwell. So the Jags really helped improve that offensive line by bringing in Norwell. On the defense, Capron Lewis-Moore is in as a reserve defensive end, provides some depth. At defensive tackle, they let Sheldon Day go. He was more of a reserve player. And they're bringing in Taven Bryan. They used their first-round pick on Taven Bryan. It'll be really interesting to watch and see how he does. How does Taven Bryan do? The Falcons passed on him, and they passed on Harrison Phillips later in the third round. So, it'll be really interesting to see how does Taven. That apparently the guy is a superstar when he does really well, when he plays, at his full strength or whatever you want to say. When he plays his best, he's unstoppable. But consistency is something that has been a problem for him. So it'll be interesting to see how does he do. The Jags defensive line, though, is stacked. They're not counting on him to come in and start as soon as he plays his first rookie game. So he's going to be a guy who they can coach up. I think it's a good pick. We'll see. Taven Bryan. Linebacker Paul Paslozni is gone. That is in the grand scheme of things, it's a big loss. But last season, he was really starting to slow down. He's approaching his mid-30s, and so, it's a loss. It's a loss. In comes in Deion King and Leon Jacobs. They drafted Leon Jacobs in the 7th round. Overall, I'd say they took a bit of a step back at linebacker from last season. At cornerback, Aaron Colvin was the starting nickel. He got a 4-year, $34 million deal with Houston. So they brought in DJ Hayden, who was a number 4 corner with, I think it was Carolina. They gave him 3 years and $19 million. So he's a cheaper option, but he's making $6 million a year instead of $8 million a year. I don't know. With the Jags having some cap space, I really do wonder if they'll regret letting Aaron Colvin go. That'll be something to keep an eye on. It really will. And finally, at safety, they let Peyton Thompson go, who is a reserve safety, more of a special teams guy. They drafted Ronnie Harrison in the 3rd round. They also brought in Cody Davis and Don Carey. So overall, I'd say, they're fine at safety. They probably upgraded at safety. So you look at the defense, took a bit of a step back at corner, probably. A little bit of a step back at linebacker. Stepped up at defensive tackle and probably defensive end and defensive end. So, their defense overall maybe slightly better than last year. It really depends on how DJ Hayden does compared to Aaron Colvin. But overall, their defense should be great again this year. On offense, their offensive line improved a little bit by bringing in Norwell. At wide receiver, they should be okay, but they took a little bit of a step back, but they improved a little bit at tight end. So overall, the Jags should be really good again this season. I think they'll be competing for the AFC Championship. In fact, to be honest with you, I think they might be the favorite to win the AFC this year. Them, the Steelers, and the Patriots. I'm honestly rooting for the Jags. I hope the Jaguars win the AFC. I'd love to see somebody new win it. I think they have a great team. They have a great defensive, maybe one of the best defensive lines in the NFL. Them and the Vikings. The Eagles also have a good defensive line. I think it'll really come down to, how does DJ Hayden do? If he can fill in the role for Aaron Colvin, and then the offense, that's the other thing, is can their wide receivers step up? And Blake Bortles, Jesus, Blake Bortles, one minute, Blake Bortles looks, in December, he looked phenomenal. And then in other games, he, a lot of the earlier parts of the season, he looked like Blake Bortles, which is to say he looked horrible. So that is, once again, your whole season probably rests on Blake Bortles. If he can play like he played in December, I think you will definitely win the AFC. If not, it's really going to depend on, can DJ Hayden fill that role for Aaron Colvin? Because if Blake Bortles looks like Blake Bortles, you're going to need to have a crazy defense again this year. But I'm rooting for you, Jaguar fans. I'm pulling for you. I'd love to see you guys win the AFC. And I like the Steelers too, but I'd love to. I like your team. I think the Jags, that's a team that deserves to win the conference. So good luck to you, Jaguar fans. If you liked this video, click subscribe because we are going to have some great videos coming up. At the end of the preseason, we are going to break down the rosters for all 32 teams. Each week, we're going to preview the upcoming week's games, and in the middle of the week, we're going to review the previous week's games. Click that subscribe button because we are going to have some of the best coverage of the NFL on YouTube. Thank you so much.